My name is LJ Stambuk, and I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. I'm delighted to have you all here today. It is a privilege to have you here, and we are very privileged to have His Excellency Ebrahim Rasool, the Ambassador of South Africa, with us today. If you missed the 9 o'clock Michael Collins show on 90.7, do not miss the repeat tonight at 9 p.m. It is one of the most fascinating interviews that I had the privilege of being present at. So please turn your radios on 90.7, and you'll be very happy that you did that. I do want to thank our sponsor today, Elliot Davis. Thank you for sponsoring this event today, and thank you for being a partner with the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. Thank you. Today with us, we have some people I would like to mention. We have Patrick Cannon, Mayor Pro Tem. Thank you, Patrick, for being here. We have Ronnie Bryant, President and CEO of the Charlotte Regional Partnership. Thank you, Ronnie, for being here. We have Catherine Hansen, the Chief Protocol of City of Charlotte. And we have Jennifer Roberts, my predecessor in this position, and a former County Commissioner Chair. Thank you all for coming here today and making this event even better. So having said that, it is my privilege to invite to the podium Patrick Cannon, Mayor Pro Tem, Charlotte.
Good afternoon. You know, it's said that good things come to those who wait, but I will tell you that greater things come to those who don't wait. Thank you to the World Affairs Council for not waiting and making the difference that you are making along the way in terms of all the things you're doing to help us to make the connection. It's really important that we get that we understand that. The one thing that has made Charlotte what it is today happens to be public-private ventures. Well, we still need more ventures, but we need those ventures beyond the borders of Charlotte, North Carolina, beyond the borders of our region, and yes, even beyond the borders of the state of North Carolina. That, of course, is indeed what you, the World Affairs Council, represents. And so, Mr. President, thank you for your level of leadership with regard to that. Bob Holt, where's Bob? Bob, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your level of leadership, and all of the board members. And wherever you are, board members, anyone that's affiliated with the council itself, please stand. Let's give them a round of applause, wherever you may be. I know you don't like recognition, but sometimes we have to pay respect where respect is due. And so I wanted to do that. Also, I'd like to acknowledge a former chairwoman of the Board of County Commission, that is the Mecklenburg Board of County Commissioners, Jennifer Roberts, also here with us today. And prior to, of course, the luncheon, I had the honor and the pleasure to meet with His Excellency, Ambassador Rasool. Indeed, it's a pleasure. Indeed, it's an honor to be in your company and to have you here in our fair city this day. We had some good conversation surrounding renewable energy, surrounding research. Hopefully, there will be an opportunity for us to be able to engage accordingly in having more discussion as it relates to those particular items and even items beyond that. We, of course, embrace you, South Africa. I do want you to know that somehow or another, I'm in South Africa, even while I'm standing here. I had someone to tell me who was there on a business trip. They were going to get a haircut, and they saw my picture up on the wall. So you know how you go to some of these barber shops and they have like the different styles of cuts and so forth? Well, they had my style of cut up there. Now, how it got to Johannesburg, I'm not quite certain, but I'm represented there accordingly. So I'm glad to be there. But on behalf of Mayor Anthony R. Fox, 11 members of the Charlotte City Council, and nearly 1 million people of the city of Charlotte, and of course those from the surrounding areas throughout our region, we welcome you to the city of Charlotte. We thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to continuing to work hand in hand with you on opportunities that will provide some level of a partnership between, of course, South Africa, as well as Charlotte, North Carolina, as well as our region. Thank you again so much for being here. Mr. Ambassador, before I take my seat, I would like to present you, on behalf of all of us represented here today, a wonderful book in the wake of the Beckler Museum of Modern Art. And it is signed by Andre Beckler himself. Please take this, enjoy this book. You will love some of the wonderful artwork within it, and all the folks. Have you seen this book? It is awesome. You got to get this book. So we want to present this to you on behalf of each and every one of us represented here this day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
It is my pleasure to introduce to you a board member, a shareholder at Elliott Davis, a native of South Africa, Thiru Govender. Thiru?
Thank you, LJ, and good afternoon to all. Dr. Carl Sagan, I'm sure each and every one of you heard of him, great American scientist and astronomer, once said, "You have to know the past to understand the present." So I thought I'd take, sorry, that better? Sorry. So I thought I'd take a few minutes, although the few minutes is not going to do justice, to give you a brief synopsis of South Africa, so you can somewhat get an idea of what happened in South Africa, and most importantly, to have a greater appreciation of our guest of honor today. South Africa has transitioned over the past 19 years from a racially segregated country to one of the largest democracies in the world. Thousands of men, women, and children lost their lives to fight for the abolishment of a very bad word called apartheid. If you survived, you were imprisoned. We all heard of the sacrifice of Mr. Nelson Mandela. There were many, many others that spent time in prison. It's a great honor for me to stand before His Excellency, as he was one of the brave hearts that spent time in prison as well. He put his life in danger and was imprisoned for this cause. As a young teenager in South Africa, I was given the very rare opportunity by my community to come to the US and follow my dreams. Whereas if I stayed in South Africa, I would have never had the opportunities I have today. But I was the fortunate one. There were millions and millions of people that were fighting the apartheid regime. I left South Africa as a teenager. I left my family and friends behind. And they sacrificed and fought for the cause. The millions in South Africa fought to get rid of the segregated living areas, the segregated schools, the segregated, you name it, it was segregated. And that was the cause, to fight for the right to vote. So through the selfless efforts of many, including the ambassador, the apartheid policies were officially ended in 1990, with the democratic elections held for the first time in 1994. Lots has changed, and with change come challenges, but also opportunities. South Africa has a thriving economy and opportunities rife for foreign investment. The ambassador will enlighten you on the direction of the country and all the opportunities, and I'm sure you'll be enlightened, and we look forward to hearing from him. It takes me great pleasure to ask Mr. Ronnie Bryant to come up and introduce the ambassador.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Come on, I'm Southern and I'm Baptist. Speak to me, please. It's an honor to join with the World Affairs Council, this great group of individuals dedicated to improving our relationship with countries around the world and being a very strong organization on the forefront of how Charlotte engages from an international perspective. The Charlotte Regional Partnership and our role as economic development organizations have been very aggressively continuing to pursue economic development opportunities from around the world. Very strong in Western Europe, where we've signed MOUs with organizations to help us identify different opportunities. We're now embarking on South America in particular, Central America, spending a lot of time in Brazil, again, where we're signing memorandums of understanding and developing partnership. We just recently signed an MOU with AfroBiz. I see Laura Elliott here. Laura, please, representing AfroBiz and helping us identify opportunities in South Africa. So to have the opportunity to have His Excellency here, it's very good for us. And I'm not going to read you his bio. I know it's been made available to you, but I will tell you that it's interesting when you look at a bio and you see a list of activities and organizations and accomplishments that individuals have been engaged in. But I think the true character of an individual is not the quantity, but the quality of such associations and such affiliations, and the sacrifices that individual has made in an effort to achieve and reach the level that our special guest has reached here in his life. We're very honored to have an individual who has been a very strong proponent of public service and providing the leadership and then making the sacrifice of serving time in jail for what he believed in. And so please join me in giving a very warm Charlotte welcome to His Excellency, the Ambassador of South Africa, Ebrahim Rasool.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brand, for that introduction. Thanks very much, LJ and the whole World Affairs Council for bringing together such magnificent people who could be doing anything of 100 things differently in their lives at this moment. Mr. Mayor, I'm particularly honored that you are spending time with us. I value the meeting that we've just had, and I think I come into a discussion on making the case for Africa and for South Africa already fairly confident that I have found in the Pro Tem Mayor someone who has the passion, the vision, and the skills to lead business from South Carolina and particularly from Charlotte to the last economic frontier in the world, the African economic frontier. It's going to take courage, and it's going to take vision, and it's going to take from business the ability to be led. And I think that that really is what I hope will happen. Thiru, thanks very much for all your facilitation. And while Carl Sagan is absolutely right, that you've got to know the past to understand the future, there is a lesson that South Africans have learned from the Greek dramatist, Agathon. Agathon said, "Not even God can change the past." If you think about it, it sounds blasphemous, because God ought to be able, Mr. Baptist preacher, God ought to be able to be doing all things. But if there's one thing God can't do, it's to change what has happened. And more, if human beings understand that truth, they will spend so much less time fretting about the past, fighting the issues of the past, trying to change the past, trying to get things done today that emanate from the past. So the past is a resource, but the past is certainly something that we also have to transcend, not forget, but we have to transcend if this future is indeed to be built. That's the great moral insight of a Nelson Mandela. Everyone calls what happened in South Africa a miracle. We refuse to call it a miracle because while it may have been divinely inspired, it was humanly done. And the moment we submit to the idea that South Africa's transition Nelson Mandela's generosity and the great reconciliation that took place in South Africa was a miracle, we say that others can't do it. I can't do it. So don't expect us to reconcile here. Let us fight it out. Don't expect us to be generous of spirit. I'm only human. And the lesson from South Africa is, you can do it. You should not defer it. You should not abdicate your responsibility to do what is right. And that foundation is the foundation that took us into Africa after South Africa was freed in 1994 and Nelson Mandela was elected as president of a democratic South Africa. Everyone thinks that Nelson Mandela's greatest sacrifice was his 27 years in jail. In fact, Nelson Mandela's greatest sacrifice may well have been the fact that if anyone could be president for life, it was him. If anyone didn't even have to bother to campaign to become president for a second term, it would be him. And yet, after one term, he retired. Not because he was sick, not because he was tired, not because he was disenchanted, not because he felt he had lost the confidence of his people or his party. He had a very simple answer. He said, if I went to my maximum term or even wanted to exceed my maximum term, I would not be setting an example for other African leaders that leaders can retire. It is important for me to retire when I can still win the next race, so that they learn the importance of not being too important. And that is where societies go wrong, when leaders overestimate their importance and they believe they are indispensable to the fortunes of their communities, their nations, and their societies. And that's what Nelson Mandela did. And the knock-on effect across Africa was enormous. Every African nation said to their president, if Nelson Mandela can retire, why are you still hanging around after 30 years? If South Africa can make a change and they had the greatest president that the world has known, then how come you still clinging on to power? And you may think that I'm storytelling, but what I am doing is to explain to you why it is that Africa is becoming what it is becoming today. Because the moral example that spread from South Africa has resulted in Africa's greatest stability. If 5, 6, 7 years ago, you were to ask me how many conflicts there were in Africa, I would have had to use both my hands and my toes to show how many. Today I can raise one hand. But I can tell you, Sudan has gone through its secession. There's issues, but they're stabilizing. Zimbabwe has a new constitution approved in referendum, and they're going to elections on the 29th of June this year, as President Obama lands in South Africa. And so I can go through one African state after the other to show how we have made peace on the continent. And as we've made peace, as we've broadened democracy, as we've deepened the rule of law, and as we've extended human rights, governments, presidents, and prime ministers began to see the dividend of democracy, human rights, peace, and freedom coming to the fore. Suddenly, African countries were becoming prosperous, because behind conflicts are local elites and global business who prefer to get the diamonds on the black market and not on the open market, who prefer to get the oil on the black market and not the open market, who prefer to get the metals that go into the cell phones on the black market and not the open market. So for some multinationals and local elites, conflict is the biggest gain. But when we saw the benefits of the open market, the transparent market, and the increasingly incorrupt market beginning to yield its fruits to us, we then understood that we were on the brink of our prosperity. And today, Africa is the second fastest growing GDP economy in the world after China. Its average is 5.5%. Some, like Mozambique, have outrageous growth figures of almost 18%. Only 2 economies are in negative growth in Africa. Today, 7 of the fastest growing economies in the world, national economies in the world, are in Africa. Can you imagine that 60% of the remaining arable land in the world today are in Africa? A few years ago, Africa was a net recipient of food aid. Tomorrow, Africa will be the guarantor of food security for the world. Can you imagine a middle class of 300 million people emerging almost the size of the United States of America, waiting for products? They don't yet have houses. And when they have houses, they will find that they need appliances. And when they need appliances, they will find that they need food to put onto the stove and into the fridge. And that's the market that Africa represents, the last remaining virgin market that the world has. It has the greatest concentration of mineral wealth. South Africa, outrageous reserves of platinum. And so we can mention one mineral after the other, and you will find it in Africa. Let's not even speak about natural gas and oil that is to be found on the continent of Africa. And so when Jim O'Neill of Goldman Sachs, who invented the term BRIC, standing for Brazil, Russia, India, and China, when he was confronted with the BRIC countries inviting South Africa in to join BRICS, to make it BRICS, Jim O'Neill said, I can't understand why they're taking South Africa in. In his own words, it's not entirely obvious. South Africa is not a big economy, unquote. And he was right. We've got 55 million people. India and China have 1 billion plus. They're growing at 9%. We're down at 3%. We don't have the kind of markets that they have. And yet it was not South Africa who asked to join BRICS. It was BRICS who asked South Africa to join it, because they needed a deposit on sub-Saharan Africa. They needed to have a gateway into the wealth of that untapped continent. China has been the biggest commodity buyer on the African continent for the last decade, been the biggest lender of capital to the African continent for the last decade. It's been the biggest builder of infrastructure for the continent for the last decade. And wherever I go in the USA, mostly as a guest of the World Affairs Council, the question is, are you preferring China to the USA? And I've tried to explain this to audiences politically, economically, sociologically, and so forth. Eventually, I'm just letting Crosby, Stills, and Nash explain it to me. If you can't be with the one you love the one you're with. Because the presence of China is not a preference for China. It is the absence of the USA that creates the presence for China. And so, what we need are leaders in the USA, people like the pro-tem mayor, who is able to say, I am willing to muster the courage for myself and for the business of Charlotte to go and confront that opportunity, preferably to complement what others are doing, but if necessary, to compete with what others are doing. Because you will understand that if Africa had investors who built infrastructure from the mine to the harbor, or someone who built infrastructure to connect Africa and integrate it economically, who would we choose? If Africa had an investor who simply wanted to extract what we had or add value to what we have, who would we choose? If Africa had a choice between an investor who developed our human resources or who brought their own labor over, who would we choose? The invitation is for Charlotte today, but for Americans in general, to come in. And the best reason to come in is not because we're appealing to your charitable instincts. You are charitable, but that's not what we're asking for. It's not that we are asking for you to continue your anti-apartheid sympathy with the black people of South Africa. That would be great, but that's not what we're appealing for. We're appealing to your instinct to make money. Returns on investment, the rate of return on investment on average in Africa is the highest in the world. It's 8%. Some sectors like property are outrageously high in places like the Western Cape, up to 30% per annum. The global average rate of return on investment is 3%. The American average is 2%. That leads us to a conclusion that there's probably, and I'm speaking conservatively, there's probably $1 trillion underinvested or not productively enough invested in the USA at this moment. As we'd say in Africa, it's stuffed under the mattress. It doesn't trust the real economy. Firstly, to make money for it, and it doesn't trust the real economy or even the banking system to preserve value for it. So it's simply riding out the storm. Our question is, why ride out the storm when there's money to be made in Africa? And as you sit here, your own minds will be bouncing with risks. You'll be thinking about safety and security. You'll be thinking about whether you've got to take out the extra insurance. You'll be thinking about whether the human resources are there. McKinsey, in its landmark study, Lions on the Move, says that whatever risks you can imagine before going to Africa, you must just know it will be mitigated within the first year's returns. So if you are spending more on insurance, if you are hiring more security, if you are investing more in human resource development and setting up management systems, whatever you invest for that entire period of your investment, you've more than made up for it in the first year of returns. For the first time, Africa, and especially South Africa, as a class of business leaders, entrepreneurs, multinational corporations, 20 of them, homegrown Africans, each with an annual turnover on average of $3 billion. For the first time, we're asking you not to take the risks on your own, but to share risks with homegrown business people in Africa, but largely in South Africa, who will hold your hand, capital raise with you, and help you do the bidding for the projects that I think should be unfolded across the African continent. And these projects are in mining, are in mineral beneficiation. These projects are in the massive infrastructure budgets that are being deployed at this moment, and for which BRICS is positioning themselves through South Africa for those contracts. We can't put all our eggs in one basket. And we're not asking you to put all your eggs in a single basket of your own. We're saying to you that when you read our laws about empowerment, you can see it negatively, but you can see it as an expression of confidence that we have risk sharers with you and capital raisers with you. And that's the proposition that I think we come to make. We are very shy sometimes as South Africa, as the last country to have gotten our independence, to project ourselves as the gateway to the African continent. I've had an argument with my fellow ambassadors who say that we sound arrogant when South Africa is projected as the gateway to the African economy. I said, you know, a little bit of experience about gates. If you see two hinges at least, it's a gate. If you see a handle, it's a gate. If you see a lock, it's a gate. If it swings open and closed, it's a gate. What it means in South African terms is, if you've got the second best banking system in the world, you're a gateway. If you've got an internationally justiciable legal system based on the best features of the American Constitution, English law, and Roman Dutch law, you're a gateway. If you've got political stability in the fact that the country will run itself sometimes despite its leaders, you're a gateway. If your rule of law is so established that when you transact in South Africa, you can prosecute in another place, you're a gateway. When you've got 20 of the world's leading multinational companies who can be partners to any partner in the world, you're a gateway. So let's not argue when you see the hinges and the locks and the handles and it swings open and closed. That's why BRICS wanted South Africa in. Because it needs access to that emerging giant called the African economy. And my appeal to Charlotte today is that you are far too complacent sometimes about your potential. You know, Professor Guy de Maupassant, the French philosopher, he once told his students when looking at the Eiffel Tower, he said, "This is the ugliest building in the whole world." And the student said, "But Professor, you have your lunch in it every day." And he said, "Because when I'm in it, I don't see it." I think the problem with Charlotte is that when you're in it, you don't see it. That this is what we see as some of the most dynamic centers of economic growth. Just the concentration of investment capital and finance available in the world, with institutions like Wells Fargo and others all here. And Mr. Mayor, you must work on the proposition I made to Wells Fargo this morning to bring them over. The second best banking system is waiting for them. When you've got this amazing innovation and creativity on renewable energy, when Africa has a net energy deficit, South Africa alone needs 40,000 megawatts of energy by 2030. We're going to get it. We've got the money to do it. We've decided that 40% of it will be renewable. You've got to come and compete for it. You've got to find the partners in South Africa and on Africa that will turn our potential energy into real energy. And so, Mr. Mayor, I'm really utilizing your presence here to say that all of this energy, all of this dynamism, all of this potential that is in this room needs a leader to help confront the last frontier in the world. I believe that Americans sometimes have a capacity to become so absorbed with their problems that they don't see the salvation across the ocean. Africa is big enough for East and West, for North and South. If you want to do an exercise and you've got a few maps to waste, cut out the USA, put it on top of Africa, and you will see that the USA fits into our Sahara Desert. That's how big Africa is. That's how big its opportunity is. And that's why you should be there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. And on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, I want to thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your comments and your views on South Africa and the African continent in general, and your perspective on investment and the future for Africa. Now, we do have a few moments here where we're going to do some question and answers. We'll pick Mr. Ambassador's brain, if you will, on questions that you may have from the audience. If you do have a question, please stand up and I will acknowledge you, and we'll get Mr. Ambassador Rasool to answer your question. And if you'll come on up, Mr. Ambassador, we have about 15 minutes that we can do questions and answers. I see the first question. The question is, could you comment on the opportunities the U.S. government may be promoting, primarily maybe even in the energy sector within South Africa?
I think that we have found what I will call the golden triangle. An opportunity in Africa, a supplier in the USA, and technology in the USA, and they all come together because we now have the apex of the triangle working, which is the financing institution. And for the last while, the financing institution of note has been Exim Bank and OPIC and IFC at the World Bank and so forth. So the World Bank is putting in $3 billion for the Madupe power station in South Africa, which is largely coal-fired, but with the technology for carbon storage, carbon capture, and carbon degradation. Exim Bank is putting in a total over a few years of $7 billion for the Kusile power station. And again, that golden triangle is working because ask Black & Veatch, ask General Electric. We've done the same with our rolling stock in terms of locomotives. 100 locomotives on order at a time when the Erie plant of General Electric was in difficulty. Along comes South Africa needing 100 locomotives. It gives life to it. The first 10 we took complete. The next 90 assembled in South Africa. And so all that golden triangle works all the time. But that golden triangle also means that private investors like banks don't have to take it all on the chin. It's how you partner with entities like Exim Bank once you've identified. If you come with that triangle, you come with a solution, because that's the key to Chinese investment, that they come with a whole triangle in place. They don't do it piecemeal. And so I think that I was in Kansas City and the business community didn't know about what Exim was doing. And I said, you can't be so ideological that you don't understand that there's all this money that is destined for Africa. All you need to do is to ask. Use the National Export Initiative. Go there, make your business case. The money is waiting for a destination and for a project. And our motto under the South African Embassy, or what we call Team South Africa in the USA, is opening markets, closing deals. And that really is the orientation as we go forward.
Lubomir, question? The question is your experience under Apartheid.
Look, I think that we've gone through, my forebears were brought to Cape Town 300 years ago as Malay slaves by the Dutch colonialists. There were entire communities exterminated, like the Khoi and the San in the Western Cape. Our long night started long ago. I think the discovery of gold and diamonds at the turn of the 20th century really meant that South Africa was simply a place to extract minerals from, and blacks were excluded, and we went through a phase of segregation. 1948, the Afrikaners of Dutch origin won the election through some gerrymandering of the borders. They didn't win the popular vote, but they delimited the voting districts in a particular way, and that was for us the greatest disaster, because what was segregation became apartheid. And so for me, growing up in effectively the 1960s and the 1970s in South Africa, my first real taste of what this monster of apartheid was when I came home from school one day and our furniture was all on the pavement. And the district that I lived in was declared white, and we all had to be out by a certain period. My father running around to find a truck to put it on and to get it to someone's house where we could live until we found a new house. It was as fundamental as that. This year, in 2013, is the 100th anniversary of the 1913 Land Act. By a stroke of a pen, 70% of the population was confined to 13% of the land. And 20% of the population had the remaining 87% of the land. So apartheid was separation, apartheid was segregation, apartheid was discrimination, apartheid was repression, but apartheid was also dispossession. And sometimes the dispossession is physical, like the land or the house. Sometimes it was dispossessing your future, because black children were not allowed to learn math and science in school. And if anyone wonders why we're struggling with our education system, it's simply because they did not have the opportunity to enter the knowledge economy. They were dead before they arrived. And so we don't simply have an unemployment problem, we have an unemployability problem. People who are functionally disabled from a global, knowledge-driven economy. And so those are the real ways in which apartheid had impacted on us. It determined who you could marry. They had an immorality act that if you held hands with someone across your color line, you could be jailed. They had separate beaches, so all the segregation was there. And what was more important was the fact that they actively patrolled it. There was no concept of the blind eye. It was the broken window approach, the zero tolerance approach. If you allowed one hand holding, you'll crumble the system. The churches were forced to separate. So you had the Dutch Reformed Church for whites, the Dutch Reformed Church for coloreds, the Dutch Reformed Church for Indians, and the Dutch Reformed Church for blacks. All with different salary scales, all with different property levels that they could, and with attempted restrictions on how to interpret the Bible. And so apartheid is probably the most intrusive, systematic system that the world had ever known. And we are just absolutely thankful that sometimes, despite the White House, there were ordinary Americans who refused to drink our wine, refused to eat our fruit, refused to come and sing in South Africa or come and do lectures in South Africa, and who marched, were arrested, and endangered themselves for this cause. And that eventually began to change the mind of even the White House. And this magnificent partnership between Ron Dellums and Bill Gray, and then Dick Lugar. When Dick Lugar said to President Reagan, constructive engagement is wrong, we then knew that we had found the thin edge of the wedge that would change US legislative history on apartheid, then we knew we had the chance of overcoming this monster, because for as long as they believed they had support in the White House and at number 10 Downing Street, they knew that they could do with us what they wanted. And so part of what I do is to thank people like you for remaining vigilant, living by your conscience, and demanding freedom for South Africans, and particularly freedom for Nelson Mandela. Thanks very much.
We do have a few more moments. Do I have another question, Larry? Nope, I'm sorry. Yeah, Stan. The question centers around the hydrogen locomotive project in South Africa. If you can comment on that. Okay.
Look, I think that I'm not familiar with the technology and the details of what goes in it, but I know that companies like Anglo American are really keen to utilize some of our liquidity and the technology that was developed and to apply it in the world. I think Sasol, our great petrochemical giant from South Africa, has just announced a $21 billion project in Louisiana to turn gas into liquid fuel. Anglo American is managing the EPA about a mining technology to bring copper in Alaska to the fore. In the USA, a $7 billion investment that will take place there. I think that we are beginning to see the world as bigger than South Africa, and sometimes even bigger than Africa. And so those are technologies that we are very keen to be sharing, and certainly I think I would like to bring some of the Anglo people to Charlotte to meet with people of that sector here in order to see how we can share expertise and technology on a matter like that. And that's one of the companies that I think could be a handholder as we start to enter sub-Saharan Africa for those opportunities.
Mr. Ambassador, on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, I want to thank you so very much for being here with us today and giving us your perspectives on South Africa and the changes that have been made. We thank you very much.